Guys, if you enjoy creepy stories, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this video with your friends and family. And also tell where you are watching from. Story 1. The House of Ice. I was 12 when we moved to Nordland, a town buried in the far north, where the snow never truly melted, and winter stretched on longer than it should. It was a place where the sky always hung low, and the trees stood silent, their branches heavy with frost. My mother had taken a job at the hydroelectric plant, and my father, who never seemed to hold a job for long, busied himself fixing up the cabin we now called home. The house was old, the kind that groaned and whispered as if it had secrets buried in its walls. But I didn't mind. I was used to quiet places. What unsettled me wasn't the house. It was what stood beyond it. At the far end of the frozen lake, past the thick line of pines, stood the House of Ice. It was small, barely more than a wooden shack, its roof sagging under the weight of endless snowfall. Unlike the other houses in town, it never looked lived in. Its windows were murky, its walls coated in a thick frost that never seemed to thaw, not even in the heart of summer. "You must never go near it," our neighbor Etta warned me one evening. She was a frail woman, bundled in layers even indoors, her hands trembling slightly as she stirred a pot of stew. "That house is not empty," my father scoffed. "It's just an old hunting shack," he muttered. But I noticed the way my mother's fingers tightened around her spoon. She knew something. It started with the notes. One evening, walking home from school, I saw a scrap of paper sticking out from beneath a rock near the path. I wouldn't have noticed it if not for the wind, which lifted its corner just enough to reveal a few scribbled words. "Hello. Do you want to play?" The handwriting was neat, every letter carefully spaced. Something about it felt. Off I glanced around, but the road was empty except for an old man shoveling snow in the distance. I left the note where it was and hurried home. The next day there was another. "I like your red jacket. Do you like the lake?" I picked it up this time, folded it neatly and slid it into my pocket. At dinner, I tried to sound casual. "Does anyone else live by the lake?" My parents exchanged a look. It was quick, like a candle flickering before going out, but I caught it. "Not anymore," my father said. That should have been the end of it. But it wasn't. I should have ignored it. But I was 12, and curiosity is stronger than fear at that age. So the next time I found a note, I wrote back. "Who are you?" I left it under the same rock. That night, I barely slept. I kept thinking about what I'd done, if I'd made a mistake. The next morning, my reply was waiting. "My name is Eric. I live in the ice house." My stomach turned. It had to be a joke, but I was already hooked. "The ice house is empty," I wrote back. The reply came faster this time. "No, it isn't." The tapping began that night, a soft, deliberate knocking against my window. I froze beneath my covers, my heart hammering in my chest. The glass was frosted over, but beyond the ice, I saw a shape. Standing there, watching. I stayed completely still, barely breathing. After what felt like hours, the shadow moved away. In the morning, when I finally worked up the courage to pull back the curtains, I found something waiting for me outside. A row of small marbles sat neatly on my windowsill. I picked one up. It was icy cold, colder than the snow itself. I didn't go to school that day. I felt sick, like something had taken root in my stomach and wouldn't let go. My mother stayed home with me, sitting at the kitchen table, watching but saying nothing. She didn't ask what was wrong, and I didn't tell her. That night, I locked my window, but the tapping came anyway. I had to see for myself. The next morning, I pulled on my thickest coat, laced up my boots, and walked across the frozen lake. The ice house looked even smaller up close. The door was warped, the wood swollen from years of dampness. My fingers trembled as I reached for the handle. It wasn't locked. Inside, the air was sharp with cold, colder than outside. My breath fogged in front of me. The floor was covered in frost, a thick layer of ice so smooth it reflected the pale light leaking through the single, narrow window. Then I saw them. Footprints, small, bare footprints, circling the room, weaving in and out of the shadows. Something shifted behind me, a whisper of movement. I turned and ran. I don't remember getting home. I don't remember slamming the door behind me or the way my mother grabbed my arm, shaking me, demanding to know what had happened. But I do remember what I saw the next morning. My father was outside, clearing the snow. I stood at my window, staring at the edge of the trees. He was there. A boy, no older than me, standing barefoot in the snow. His hair was white, his lips tinged blue. He smiled. Then he turned and walked back toward the ice house. I never saw him again. But sometimes, in the deepest part of winter, when the lake is frozen solid and the nights stretch on longer than they should, I still hear the tapping, and I still find marbles on my windowsill. I never wanted to return to the cabin. Yet there I was, standing on the edge of a frozen lake, staring at the dark silhouette of the place I once swore I'd never set foot in again. The tall pines surrounding it cast long, skeletal shadows under the dim glow of the moon. A thin mist hovered above the snow, making the entire place look like something trapped between reality and a dream. But the lights inside the cabin were on. I hadn't been here in over a decade, not since my father passed. No one should have been here. A sinking feeling twisted in my stomach. I should have turned back, gotten in my truck, and left. But something kept me there. Something deeper than just curiosity. Maybe it was the same old pull this place had always had on me, the same strange grip it had on my childhood. I exhaled and took a step forward, my boots crunching softly against the snow. The air was thick with the scent of pine and something faintly metallic. The lake, now frozen solid, stretched behind me like an unbroken mirror, reflecting the sky in eerie stillness. The closer I got to the cabin, the heavier my chest felt. My father had built this place long before I was born, long before I ever had the chance to ask why he felt the need to have a home so far removed from the world. I never understood his paranoia. He would check the locks 3 times before bed, keep a shotgun by the door, and mutter warnings about being prepared for anything. At the time, I thought he was just a man obsessed with survival. But as I stood there, staring at that slightly open front door, I realized there had always been more to it than that. The wind howled softly through the trees, the branches swaying like outstretched fingers. I swallowed and hesitated on the steps. The door wasn't just unlocked, it was open by a few inches. I was supposed to be alone here. A shadow passed by the window. My breath hitched. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to leave. But something deeper, something darker, kept me rooted in place. A part of me needed to know who or what was inside. Slowly, I pushed the door open. The warmth hit me first, a stark contrast to the icy air outside. A fire crackled softly in the hearth, its glow casting flickering shadows across the wooden walls. Everything inside looked untouched. The old leather armchair where my father used to sit, the bookshelves filled with his dog-eared novels, the worn rug that had been there for as long as I could remember. It was all exactly the same. But the air carried something else, something beneath the scent of burning wood, something rotten. I stepped inside, shutting the door behind me. The cabin creaked as the wind rattled its old frame. But beneath that sound was something else. A presence. I wasn't alone. A creak from the upstairs landing made my blood run cold. The stairs curled up toward the second floor where my father's bedroom was. I had spent countless nights as a child running my fingers along that railing, listening to the floorboards groan beneath my small feet. Now, the sound was coming from someone else's feet. I reached for my phone, only to remember it was still in my truck. Stupid. Another creak. Whoever was up there wasn't trying to hide. I took a slow step forward, heart pounding against my ribs. My eyes flicked to the old hunting rifle mounted above the fireplace, but the dust covering it told me what I already knew. It hadn't been touched in years. It was probably useless. Another step, another sound. Breathing. Low, steady, deliberate. I swallowed hard and moved toward the stairs, each step beneath me groaning as if warning me to turn back. The hallway at the top was dark, except for the faintest sliver of moonlight cutting through a half-open door at the end. My father's old room. I reached the doorway and hesitated, fingers curling against the wood. The breathing had stopped. I pushed the door open. The room was exactly as I remembered it. The bed was still made, the quilt tucked in perfectly, the way my father had always kept it. The closet door was open just a crack, revealing nothing but darkness inside. The window, slightly fogged from the cold, overlooked the lake, and then I saw them. Eyes. Not a reflection, not a shadow. Eyes. Watching me from the darkness of the closet. Wide. Unblinking. A shudder ran through me. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. My mind screamed at me to run, but my body refused to listen. And then the door creaked open further. A hand slid out first, pale, thin fingers curling against the wood. Then came the rest of the figure, stepping forward into the dim light. It was wearing my father's coat. The same coat he had worn the last time I saw him. The same coat that should have been buried with him. A choked gasp escaped me as I stumbled back. My boot caught the edge of the rug, and I nearly went sprawling, but I caught myself against the dresser. The figure didn't move, just stood there, staring at me with hollow, unreadable eyes. I opened my mouth to speak, but no words came. And then, in a voice that wasn't quite human, it whispered, "You were never supposed to come back." The air in the room dropped to a suffocating chill. My breath came out in a trembling cloud as I backed toward the door. The figure took a step forward. I ran. I didn't think. I just bolted, my feet slamming against the wooden floor as I flew down the stairs. The sound of footsteps followed, but I didn't dare look back. I reached the door and wrenched it open, the icy air cutting into my skin as I stumbled outside. But as I sprinted toward my truck, something made me glance back. The figure stood in the doorway, watching me. And then, one by one, the cabin's lights flickered off. I didn't stop running until I reached the truck, my hands shaking as I fumbled with the keys. The engine roared to life, and I slammed it into reverse, my tires kicking up a spray of snow as I sped down the icy road. In the rearview mirror, the cabin grew smaller, swallowed by the trees. The last thing I saw before I lost sight of it completely was the front door, still open, and the faint outline of someone standing just inside, watching, waiting. I never went back. But some nights I still wake up in a cold sweat, the whisper echoing in my ears. You were never supposed to come back. I was 11 when my father took the job at Black Hollow Outpost, a remote research station buried deep in the Arctic tundra. The station had once been part of a grand scientific endeavor, but as funding dwindled, the majority of the researchers abandoned it, leaving only a skeletal crew to maintain what was left. My father, an atmospheric scientist, was assigned to monitor weather patterns and electromagnetic activity in the region. It was supposed to be a 6-month contract, just long enough for him to collect the necessary data and return home. I hadn't wanted to come. I was pulled from my school, my friends, and everything familiar. Now, instead of city lights and playgrounds, all I had were metal-paneled cabins, the endless expanse of snow, and the eerie, unbroken silence of the Arctic. The outpost consisted of a handful of buildings: the main research station, a storage shed, the communications tower, and the living quarters where my father and I stayed. The station itself was old, the kind of place where the pipes groaned in the night and the wind seeped through the cracks, making everything feel just a little too alive. The radio tower, a rusted remnant of past expeditions, stood apart from the rest of the structures, stretching toward the sky like a skeletal hand. It was rarely used anymore, except for emergency transmissions. I spent most of my time alone. There was no internet, no TV, no one my age. The researchers were too busy with their work to pay much attention to me, and my father, though he tried, was often preoccupied with his endless charts and data logs. One evening, my father mentioned that the temperature was expected to plummet overnight and warned me not to go outside. At -40, he told me, you can get frostbite in minutes. I nodded, but wasn't really listening. That night, after my father had gone to bed, I sat in my room staring out the tiny window. The research outpost was bathed in an eerie glow from the moonlight reflecting off the snow. The silence outside was absolute, so suffocating that I felt like if I screamed, the sound would just vanish into the void. A thought crossed my mind. What would it be like to stand outside, completely alone in the frozen darkness? I grabbed my thick coat and boots, slipped out of the cabin, and stepped into the biting cold. The air burned my skin instantly, but the thrill of being outside on my own outweighed the discomfort. The snow crunched beneath my feet as I made my way toward the communications tower. The tower was ancient, its metal frame streaked with rust. I climbed the ladder, wincing as my fingers, exposed even for a moment, stung with cold. At the top, I perched on the ledge, looking over the endless white expanse. The world felt so empty, so still. And then, a sound crackled through the radio speakers below me. It was faint at first, buried under static. A whisper, then clearer. Isaac. My name. My stomach twisted. The outpost didn't receive radio transmissions at this hour. There were no active frequencies. My father and the other researchers were asleep. I hesitated, then whispered back, Dad. Static. And then, Isaac, are you there? The voice was deep, slightly distorted. Something was off about it. It sounded wrong, like a voice pulled from an old broken recording. A chill that had nothing to do with the cold ran through me. That was when I heard it, the soft, rhythmic creak of footsteps on the ladder. I turned sharply. Through the thick fog, I could just barely make out a figure climbing up toward me, a dark, human-shaped silhouette. I should have spoken, asked who it was, demanded an answer, but fear locked my throat. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. Then, the figure reached the top. A man, or something that looked like one. His face was shadowed, but his eyes glowed faintly in the darkness, like dim embers beneath a veil of smoke. There you are, he said. His voice was the same one I had heard on the radio. Something about his presence was wrong. It was like he didn't belong in this world, like he had stepped out of a place where the rules of reality were different. I stumbled backward, my boots slipping on the icy metal. My breath came in sharp gasps, clouding the air. And then he moved. Not stepped, not lunged, but shifted toward me, like a glitch in a video game, his body flickering as if it wasn't entirely solid. That was all it took. I turned and ran. I half fell, half climbed down the ladder, my numb hands barely able to hold on. My vision blurred with panic as I hit the ground, my legs almost giving out beneath me. Behind me, the tower loomed, silent and still. The man, if he was still up there, didn't follow. He just watched. I bolted toward the cabin, snow crunching violently under my boots. My breath tore from my lungs in ragged gasps. I didn't dare look back. I reached the door, yanked it open, and slammed it shut behind me. My father's voice cut through the panic. "What's going on?" I turned to see him standing in the dim light of the cabin, his expression shifting from grogginess to concern. "There was someone outside," I gasped. My father frowned. He pulled on his coat, grabbed a flashlight, and stepped onto the porch. I didn't want to follow him, but I couldn't bear to be alone inside either. The landscape was empty. The tower stood in the fog, its rusted frame stretching into the sky. No movement, no footprints but mine in the snow. "Are you sure?" my father asked quietly. I nodded. He exhaled slowly, rubbing his hands together. "Let's go inside." That was it. He didn't dismiss me. He didn't scold me for sneaking out. And that was what scared me the most. The storm hit the next day. The outpost was locked down, cut off from the outside world. My father didn't bring up what had happened, but I knew he was thinking about it. He was watching the radio tower more often, checking the transmission logs, listening to static like he expected to hear something whispering back. A week later, he announced we were leaving. He didn't finish the contract. He didn't explain. He just said we were going, and I didn't argue. I haven't been back to Black Hollow since. I've read about the place. It was shut down a few years later, deemed too costly to maintain. The last few researchers who stayed there reported strange electrical disturbances, sudden power failures, odd transmissions picked up by the radio tower. No one ever found out what caused them, but I know. And I will never forget the voice on the radio, or the way it knew my name. I never wanted to live alone. Not really. There was something about the silence that unnerved me. It wasn't the kind of quiet that felt peaceful or serene, like the stillness of a forest or the hush of freshly fallen snow. No, this was a different kind of silence. Heavy, pressing, expectant. When my last roommate, Daniel, got engaged and moved out, I was left in the house on Ashmere Road. A rental I had never really planned to stay in for long, but had somehow made my home for the past 3 years. It wasn't much, just an old 2-story with creaky wooden floors, narrow hallways, and a fireplace that crackled unpredictably at night. The house felt older than it looked, with doors that sometimes stuck for no reason and a staircase that groaned as if it had lungs of its own. But I told myself that was just paranoia. Houses settle. Wood shifts. It was nothing more than an old home with a little too much character. At least, that's what I used to believe. The first contact loneliness did strange things to a person. It turned an empty house into something too empty. It made shadows seem longer, made noises in the distance sound intentional, deliberate. I had never really been good at meeting people. That's why dating apps had become a bit of a crutch for me. Something to do while sitting on the couch, scrolling through faces I would never meet. I wasn't looking for love, just some kind of distraction. Then there was her. Her name was Lilith. She wasn't the kind of person who stood out in a sea of profiles, 2 grainy photos, no last name, and a bio that simply read, "Just passing through." There was something about her that kept me staring, though, a curiosity I couldn't explain. I swiped right. We matched. Her first message came instantly. "You seem interesting." That wasn't a normal opener. Most people started with a joke or a casual, "Hey." But she was direct. I liked that. We talked that night, and the conversation had a strange rhythm to it, quick, engaging, but also elusive. She had a way of answering questions without really answering them. "Where are you from?" I asked. "Here and there," she replied. "What do you do?" "Whatever I need to." It should have been a red flag, but instead, it intrigued me. After 3 days of sporadic conversation, she asked me something unexpected. "What does Christmas feel like for you?" It was a strange question, but I answered honestly. "I don't know. Kinda empty now." She replied almost immediately. "Then let's change that." A strange invitation. She wanted to come over. There was something strange about how she phrased it, though. She didn't ask. She just told me, "I'll be there at 9. We'll make something feel like Christmas." I hesitated before agreeing. I didn't even have a tree up. I barely had decorations. "Then we'll fix that," she said. I don't know why I said yes. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was the simple fact that I didn't want to spend another night staring at my phone, waiting for nothing to happen. So I cleaned, I vacuumed, wiped down the counters, even made sure the old fireplace was set up for a fire. As 9 p.m. neared, I grabbed a bottle of wine from the shelf and set out 2 glasses. Then I waited. The arrival. She knocked. Not the light, tentative knock of someone unsure if they were at the right house, but a deliberate, steady knock. When I opened the door, I was immediately taken aback. She was tall. I don't just mean slightly above average. I mean I had to look up. And I'm not short. At 5'10", I rarely feel small. But she had to be at least 6 feet, maybe taller. She stepped inside before I could say anything, and the first thing I noticed was the scent. Thick, cloying perfume, so overpowering it nearly made me cough. Underneath it, something else, something faintly metallic. She wore a long black coat, buttoned all the way up, and her dark hair fell in loose waves over her shoulders. She didn't look at the room. She only looked at me. "You live alone," she said. It wasn't a question. I nodded, suddenly uneasy. She smiled, but there was something strange about it. Good. The wine. We sat on the couch, and she sat too close. Close enough that our legs touched. Her presence was almost suffocating, like she took up more space than her body should have. I poured the wine. "To new traditions," she said, raising her glass. We clinked glasses. Then she spilled it, deep red soaking into my couch like blood. She didn't react at first, just stared at it. Then slowly she whispered, "Sorry." I hurried to get paper towels, scrubbing at the stain. I told her it was fine, even though I was irritated. When I looked up, she was still staring at the stain, eyes fixed, unmoving. Something in me whispered that this was wrong. To break the tension, I told her I had decorations in the basement. "I'll wait here," she said softly. I left her on the couch and went downstairs. The basement was colder than it should have been. The air felt too thick. I found the old bins stacked against the far wall. I had just grabbed the first one when I staggered. My head swam. My vision blurred. I hadn't had enough wine for this. Something was wrong. She was gone. I forced myself up the stairs, bin in hand. But when I reached the top, she was gone. The couch was empty. The wine glass sat untouched. The door was still locked. I checked my phone. No new messages. I called her name. Silence. Then, on the floor, near the couch, I saw something small. A tag. Torn fabric. I picked it up, my fingers trembling. It was old, the ink faded, but I could still make out what it said. It wasn't a clothing tag. It was a hospital bracelet. The name on it wasn't Lilith. I don't know what happened after that. I don't remember falling asleep. I only remember waking up to silence. The wine glass was gone. The tag had disappeared, and yet the scent of perfume lingered, thick, cloying, suffocating. I checked my phone. Her profile was gone. Her number disconnected. And every year when December comes, that scent fills my house. I don't think she ever left.